what that does in a room of people who aren't expecting that. It's just visible. People can't help it. It's like a little bit of that, And I always think that's it's valuable. It's important. Sometimes it takes a little bit of courage. Mostly, for me now, it's just it's important never to leave that out of various stories that I get to do. One of the other places for me besides legislature, and I have to say, we've worked hard on trying to help people in the legislature understand these terms. Oh my goodness. I was the chief author of the marriage bill that we just passed 2 years ago, and that and it was with the help of so many people here who did that very thing of coming out, and that whole story of an incredible organizing, grassroots organizing, where people just came out over and over and over, every place. So, but one of the things I was going to say about that is a very important thing happened in the legislature, which I really owe thanks to my colleague, Barbie Russo. She went through and described what transgender is to legislators, 134 legislators sitting in the House of Representatives. She described that in real personal terms in her own family. And doing that was, again, just an incredible act of courage. She was talking about her own child and how she herself understood that and how she wanted the rights that we were talking about there for her children and all of her children, but particularly making sure that her son would have that opportunity, her transgender son. And she just did some real education, and it was like 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, now do you get it? And it was really helpful. And I just wanted to mention there's many venues where all that can happen. I just give her so much credit for that, for the courage that it took to do that. She runs for re-election next year, like the rest of us in the legislature, and I'm sure there will be some footage of her describing that will be used by her opponents. Just like there'll probably be some footage of my recent marriage for my opponents. Never not had an opponent or 2 or 3. But that was a very special opportunity for me. And actually, my partner Jacqueline and I, my spouse Jacqueline and I, I keep remembering to say that, we got married on the farm that is part of an organic environmental justice work that Lisa just mentioned briefly. We came into we got married in the garden, and we came into the scene on a tractor and queered it up, I guess you'd say. we had a great time, and I just couldn't stop smiling the whole time. But I want to say this is in a small rural area where the people that we invited everybody in that area who were part of the community that works with us, the mayor, and I was reminded that on the front page, this is near North Branch, Minnesota, I was reminded that one of the really courageous persons that were out there, and we haven't really had a chance to get to know them. They weren't invited. It was kind of a small wedding, but I would have just to honor them. These two Courier, I think it's called, as to having just gotten married after we passed the law. And these women with their gray hair and their smiles with each other on this page are really a role model for rural folks coming out, and just for all of us, and just another example of that courage that it takes. So I guess when we talk about what the challenges are, I guess it's just to constantly realize how important this is. It's just, you just can never take it for granted that it's not going to be important for some people to hear that the person standing before them is GLBTQ, that we are in some part of that whole spectrum, and that we are trying to just be ourselves. I think that the challenge that we bring is again, it's very valuable. I wanted to tell you one other challenge I have, though, which is kind of personal. It's related to this library issue, which is I have a lot of papers, a lot of documents about what we were doing back in the in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000 and 2010. I mean, I just have too many of them, and Lisa's been after me to get them to her. So I'm just sharing with you my challenge, which is to try to preserve some of that, because I know that one of the things when I was trying to do some research as a young lesbian woman was I just so hungry for those bits of stories and people here and there. And I know that we owe that. I know that I owe that to the folks that are here. And so I just want to put that out there. So share my, you can help encourage me to eventually get it all together.
Yes.
So thank you.
I'm going to ask you all, I'm going to deputize all of you now. You're all part of the crew that's going to offer to help Karen pack up the boxes, bring them to the library. So, I want to ask one other question, then we can open it up to the floor, because I want to give you a chance for there to be a little bit of a dialogue. So even within the GLBT community, we often need to expand our history or our narrative to be more inclusive. So GLBT history itself tends to be dominated by the stories and the voices of cisgendered gay white men. That's certainly true in the Tretter collection in the archive, and we have this much material on cisgendered gay white men and this much material on lesbians and people of color in the trans community. And actually, our least represented community is the bi plus community, although Martha is valiantly working on helping us address that, which I appreciate enormously. And the Transgender Oral History Project that we've been able to hire Andrea to do will now help us add tremendous depth and complexity to the stories we have available about the transgender experience. But do any of you have things you'd like to talk about ways that you're working to diversify the voices within the GLBT community, strategies that you'd recommend, things that you think people need to remember? Again, as we try to be more inclusive of trans voices, voices of color, voices from the disability community, older voices, bi voices, any other voices that are too often excluded.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Because it actually sort of brings up an issue that I kind of wanted to talk about in the first question. And so currently there's an exhibition that I curated that's at Intermedia Arts. And it's an exhibition, it's a photo exhibition of transgender and gender nonconforming people throughout the Twin Cities. But it's primarily people of color who are represented in this exhibition. And you know, it's really interesting. So I've been out for, I don't know, 24 plus years now, a long time. But you know, Caitlyn Jenner came out like 4 months ago and is now the most well-known transgender person in the world. And so, and that's great. That's great for her. You know, it breaks my heart to think that she dealt with that pain for 65 years. But it also concerns me that now that narrative is going to be the story that most people throughout the world associate with the transgender identity. You know, that you can just wake up and go to your doctor and get all of these medical procedures and have a reality TV show and be on the cover of the most famous magazine in the world, like Vogue, like who, like her. I mean, that, like, Hollywood actresses fight over that honor to be on the cover of Vogue, and that's where she was. So, so I think it's really critical that we have those stories, that we have those images, that we have those narratives from the real lived experiences of everyday transgender and nonconforming people, which is again one of the main reasons why I wanted to be a part of this project here at the university, the Transgender Oral History Project. I was thrilled that it was going to happen, and I'm sure that anybody who had this job would do an outstanding job, and the end product would be amazing. But I wanted to be sure that the end product had Latina voices, had disabled voices, had voices from people of color, um, a whole range of ages, you know. So far, the youngest person that we've interviewed in this project is 20-year-old student over at McAllister College, to a 75-year-old uh, trans woman, you know, who is Caucasian and just has this amazing story and history. Um, so I think it's really critical. I think the only way we do it is to be intentional about it. We have to speak that this is our goal. We can't say, "Oh yeah, we understand that all lives matter, so we're just gonna we're gonna make sure we infuse it." No, we have to be intentional. We have to be explicit, right? And then we have to try and achieve that stated goal. I think that's the only way that it really happens. There's other strategies too, but I'm gonna let other people speak to some of that stuff.
Yeah, there's so much to say about this. You know, I'll just invoke Cherie Eisner again. She has a chapter in her book. The book is By Notes for a Revolution. And she has a chapter in the book called the GGGG. And I don't know if any of you have heard this, but I kind of like it. Because what she says is that we don't really have an LGBT narrative in this country, or an LGBTQ narrative in this country. The dominant narrative is gay, 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 gay. And what I mean by that specifically is that there are certain parts of the LGBT community that have more privilege than others. You know, whiteness is privileged, being male is privileged, being more well off is privileged, you know, having a secure immigration status, speaking English as your main language is privileged here. And, you know, we look at some of our national organizations and we see who they honor and who gets attention and who gets space. And it's generally not bi people, and it's not not trans people, except now, you know, Caitlyn Jenner. So what I am saying here is that each of us in this room has a responsibility to challenge that narrative every day, that we give space and honor all parts of our community. So I'm going to ask you to start saying the word transgender, to say the word bisexual. When you look at what projects you're working on, who gets funding, where your donations go, where you spend your time and your energy, you know, where is that going? Is it going to people of color in our communities? I went to an event recently where the question of where do we go as a LGBT community after marriage equality? You know, I'm hearing the word on the street is that GLBT organizations are seeing donations go way, 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 way down now that the marriage is legal. And that is not okay, because marriage only benefits some people in very particular ways. So that's one answer to that question. Another answer is, and this is very true for trans communities, but I want to talk a little bit about why it matters so much that we have bisexual stories in this archives. Bi people still, I was rereading this essay last night that Ann Phibbs assigned to me in a class at Metro State. And that has been in my mind recently, Ann, and it took me a while to figure out where you got it from. And in this essay by Amanda Udis Kessler, it's called Bisexuality in an Essentialist World, Towards an Understanding of Biphobia. She does an amazing job of talking about the cost of bisexual erasure and invisibility and what that means, the cost of stigma, the cost of having to constantly defend our very existence. And there's real costs. And I could give you an hour presentation on this. And in fact, the Bisexual Organizing Project has a workshop that we take on the road about this very thing, if anybody's interested in booking us. But we have the worst bisexual people health outcomes, mental health outcomes, sexual violence outcomes, and other socioeconomic outcomes of anyone in the LGBT community other than trans people. And nobody knows this. But we now have very clear data that show this, and I'll give you 2 examples. In the National Partner in Sexual Violence Survey of 2010, talking about the prevalence of rape among women, they said about approximately 17% of straight women had been raped, 13% of lesbians had been raped, and 47% of bi women had been raped. And unfortunately, they don't give a number here in this particular survey for trans people. Here's another one that's more local. This is the 2013 LGBTQ, and again, they didn't get the trans in there, so they got to work on that. Youth Mental Health Survey here in Minnesota, talking about suicidal ideation over the past year. 29% of gay plus lesbian youth grouped together had experienced suicidal ideation. 22% of questioning youth, 9.5% for heterosexual youth, and 43% for bisexual youth. So when we are rendered invisible, and when you allow, any of us allow bi-stigma or biphobia to occur around you unchallenged, people are dying from that. And I mean that seriously. So what does this have to do with the Tretter collection? What this has to do is our stories must be here. They must be here, especially for our youth to find and use. And if they are not here, it perpetuates this incredibly toxic and traumatic stigmatization that is damaging our communities. Another thing, if you go to the Williams Institute website, you can find that there's a great graphic there where they look at a whole bunch of surveys about demographics of GLBTQ Americans. And there are a lot of surveys now that are showing that there are about as many bisexual people as gay and lesbian people put together in this country, or more, depending on how you define it. And they were seeing that especially when we look at younger generations. There was a study that came out from the UK just recently where the numbers were incredibly high for people who identified bisexual, and even more people who identified as sort of like heteroflexible or not entirely really totally straight. I mean, they had a number of different categories that were more granular. So we're here in large numbers, and we need to have our stories be findable. And I'm a librarian, I'm a reader, and I believe that stories will save you. Stories can save you, and they need to be here. And we need to make sure that anything we can do, anyone, GLBTQ, get them to donate their materials here to the Tretter collection. So that's my a little bit of a rant, and I apologize for that, but I think it's really important that people have this information and think about it.
Man, Martha, if I can just add a little bit to your comments, because I mean, your poignant share. I mean, trans people were written out of that whole, all of those statistics, like not even, and the reality is that transgender is a gender identity, and so trans people are gay, lesbian, and bisexual, and so having that double impact, and I can tell you that there have been studies that have been done that the majority of homophobia that people face is not necessarily based on who they sleep with. It's more about their gender presentation and their gender expression. So consequently, men who are more feminine and women who are more masculine are the people who face more discrimination, more housing discrimination, more employment discrimination, more violence on the street. Like, a straight appearing white guy walking down the street who happens to be gay. Nobody's calling him a fag while they're driving in their pickup truck down the street, right? But but if he is exhibiting anything that transgresses the gender norms of our culture and society, then he's faced with that level of discrimination. So I would argue that we really, and if we want to have forward human progress, Karen, we have to center transgender people in in any conversation that has to do with social justice, equity, and equality for all people. That includes the feminist movement. That includes the immigration movement. That includes equal access to health care. Any of those conversations, if you're not including trans people, the people who are most impacted by all of these injustices in our culture and society, then we're leaving an entire group of people behind. And not only that, we're damaging ourselves because we're not getting to the real issues.
Martha, I didn't realize you were also a student of ANVIBS. I was a student of ANS as well, GLBT social movements, and that's actually where I met Jean Tretter many, many years ago. And I think that it helps me think about this question because when I worked as Jean's assistant for many years, and one of the things that I noticed while I was working with Jean in the archives is that there were questions I would ask like, where's the trans stuff from Minnesota? Like, I know it's here someplace. And so I'd just go walking down the aisle and I'd be like, where is it? And he'd say, oh, well, here it is. And it'd be like one little box. And I really discovered that there was this staggering absence in the Tretter collection related to basically anybody who was not a white gay man. And so that it illustrates this problem that we have with published knowledge, with the idea that of what published knowledge means, of what historical knowledge can be. If you take a limited view of that, a kind of a traditional view of that, you're going to exclude a whole bunch of people who did not have the means to create this published knowledge. So if you think about in the 70s and 80s, all of these white gay men who had the resources to run mimeograph machines and create paper and create all of that stuff that winds its way up in the archive. And you think about all the folks who didn't have those means to make that stuff and how their stuff just didn't have enough stuff to produce, on top of maybe a certain bias in collecting that most LGBT archives demonstrate. Then you can see the problems that historians have when they are using those archives to write a more traditional book, like a book about history. And then if you think about my own biases that I would clearly have because I can check off every single, what's the word I'm looking for? Social benefit. Come on, help me out. Privilege, thank you. Every privilege, even the privilege to not even recall privilege immediately, that I can check off every single box with that, and that's going to incredibly limit my capacity to understand certain historical realities, and that I'm the one who publishes the book about it and how dangerous that can be. So you're talking about actually two levels of privilege. I think that the way how those of us who do have privileges can help illustrate that is by recognizing the privileges that we have, by trying to at least create a springboard for discussion, which I think Land of 10,000 Loves is. I'm very clear in the beginning of the book that it's an introduction intended for conversation, and that's about it. That hopefully somebody will read Land of 10,000 Loves and say, wow, I'm not really seeing much about myself here, and then use that as a way to help engender that conversation. That's really the intent that I had. But there are clear limitations with that, and so I'm hoping that we can talk about that later on.
Before I let Karen answer the question, I just want to piggyback on that a little bit. I think Stewart and I had similar experiences in coming into the archive and finding out what the holes were. I just want to clarify that as an archive, we cannot archive what does not exist. So the lesbians that were reaching consensus instead of taking minutes, I can't put in the archive. And the trans people who purged their material and that's gone, I can't put in the archive. And the bisexual organizations that don't exist, because there's 6, 7 in the entire country. 6 in the entire country. I can't archive what doesn't exist. So Jean certainly had a focus as a cis gay white man, and that's what he knew mostly. And most of this he did on his own effort, not as an academic archive, but because he was passionate about history, and thank heavens he did. And he did deliberate outreach to try and find materials from communities of color, lesbian community, trans community, bi community, but we cannot archive what does not exist. So there are the biases, there are the privileges, the blind spots, but even when you try and overcome those, we don't have what wasn't created, we don't have what wasn't written down. So that's a real challenge for us as an archive, and I'll come back to that in my closing, but I just...
And Lisa, just to say, I'm so grateful that you are recognizing, and that's what I'm talking about, is that recognizing those biases, and then having Andrea and folks creating the, that information and going and collecting that information is why it's so crucial, and why I'm so grateful that everybody's doing the work that they're doing.
Yep. Karen, did you?
Maybe just very briefly, because I think you really covered a lot of territory. But one of the things I was thinking about, because when Andrea starts saying a little bit more, is, the privilege doesn't just, and leaving out parts of our community doesn't just hurt the individual who's left out. It hurts the whole community, and it weakens us. And I can tell you, just from a legislative standpoint, that's the first place where the opposition strikes. Where every year there's, since we passed in 1993, maybe there's 1 or 2 years where there wasn't an effort to take out transgender people out of just the basic civil rights law. I'm not even talking about marriage. I'm just talking about 1993 when we add sexual orientation to the Minnesota Human Rights Act, which, by the way, still, as far as I know, is the most inclusive of our community of any civil rights act in the country. But almost, there's always an effort by someone, some new person comes in and they, let's see if we can take out this part of that part. And it often, it goes towards what they perceive as the weakest link. And so, and then you lose one part there and then more goes and more goes. So I think it's in everyone's interest to make sure that we're all inclusive. It's just, we need that so bad.
Thank you. I wanted to give people an opportunity to ask questions. Any of you have questions you'd like to? Okay, and Anne will come to you with the microphone. Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
Oh, great. So I really appreciate all of your comments, and I wanted to know, what are your strategies for self-care? Because you just talked a lot about how it's really hard to be a queer person, to be a trans person. How do you get the energy to come out over and over again? And what do you do when someone says something really messed up and you have to go to a panel the next day and be really vulnerable and speak your truth? How do you do it?
I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I mean, it's sort of like a buzzword almost now, right? Self-care, and Lisa mentioned that I was given a Bush fellowship, a couple of years ago, privilege, right? But a big part of that whole fellowship was really about, sort of what they called reflective leadership, and how do you remain mindful and sort of take care of yourself so that you can continue to be a productive leader. And one of the things that I discovered in that process is the role that sort of, and it's going to sound a little corny, but the role that tennis plays in my life. Like, I'm a tennis player, and it's an opportunity for me to just, it's not a team sport. It's kind of just me, and it's not even against the opponent. If you ever play tennis, really, it's yourself. It's kind of this mental game, and so I'm sort of competing with myself, but I get to let all of that other stuff go. And so that's one way that I really try to take care of myself and give myself some space to not think about all of the things that are going on in my world, and try to regroup and regain some energy and that kind of thing. I'm pretty I'm pretty good about not dealing with emails and all of that stuff after, 5 or 6 o'clock after work. Like, you know, Monday morning, if you email me on a Saturday, like I'm gonna get back to you on Monday. So that's one of the ways that I try to deal with it. But it was interesting, Karen. Last night I did a panel. I'm in this anthology called Blues Vision, and it's an anthology of African American writers in Minnesota. 100 years of African American authors in Minnesota. So it's a deep honor to be a part of that. But it's really, I mean, I would say 98% of the authors in the book are, hetero, cisgender, and you got Lisa gave you the definitions for cisgender, so look it up. But you know, I've found myself struggling to come out. Um, and and the poems that I read, like I have a new book coming out, and it's called "The Tea Is Not Silent." So Martha, the tea is no longer silent. We're not going to be silent. It's coming out December 3rd. Quick plug: book release party at Minneapolis Institute of Arts, or MIA. Um, but um, but I had a really hard time, and I didn't read any sort of trans specific poems, though I did, identify myself as a trans person. But I had to think about it, and it was a challenge. So it's always a challenge. It never ends.
Do any of the others of you want to address that?
I'll just say one thing about self-care, and that's about the importance of finding community. It's my community that saves me, right? And having that, those people who get me, and that is what, has made all the difference for me over the past 20 years.
And sometimes in the trans community, though, those are the people who are like clawing and killing each other too. Well,
Karen or Stewart, do you have anything you'd like to say?
Well, I love that question because I think I'm still trying to figure it out. I don't do as good a job as I should with that. I when I was talking with these nurses, they were asking what happens when you lose and stuff. And I said, I'm really grateful for tear ducts. So there's a time to cry, and to be able to do that with friends and with people. I've been very fortunate to have a supportive community, supportive family, supportive partner. I mean, but that's getting there is a lot of work. I mean, getting those supports developed didn't just happen. I mean, you all know that, right? I mean, we have to create those supports. I also there's nothing like pulling weeds out of a patch when they're really, just like things that do. But one of my resolutions is to do more physical exercise. I used to run and do a lot more than I do now. So thank you for that question. Probably make a promise to myself again to pick up some of that stuff.
I want to put in a pitch for creating baby radicals. I've had the opportunity in the Tretter collection to have some students work with me, and they've come away and they've just become so engaged with the archive that they're like, okay, I need to go do this now. I need to go to library school. I need to get involved in this stuff. I want your job. When are you leaving? And there's really nothing more energizing than see somebody else uncover that passion and really plug into something. So to reiterate what all of you said, but also I'm a big believer, and I'm still trying to get my toaster oven. So, does anybody else have a question for the panel? Kate, do you want to? Kate's in the back, and then we can come back up to Jason.
And then Jason.
So this is kind of a follow-up to Lisa's point that we can't collect what we don't have. As an archivist, I'd like to know, have any of you found, either in the Tretter collection or somewhere else in the archives, something that you've been like, yes, this was kept, thank goodness we have this story, this document, to tell that history? Has anyone had that kind of moment?
I know Stewart and I have. Stewart, do you want to? Karen has the.
when I was doing research for Land of 10,000 Loves, I found these bizarre indexes for newspapers that exist that were created in the 70s, 80s, 90s. They were created by librarians before the budgets got cut. And they read the newspaper every day and would catalog them according to subjects. And so they're in the Historical Society. A few other universities still have the copies of these. I think there's one over at Wilson, if you want to go check it out. But I read through this index and was looking for terminology that would be helpful for my research for 10,000 Loves. And I did find one entry for transsexual, and it became the basis for this art. One of the little sections that I wrote about in Land of 10,000 Loves. 10,000 Loves is basically a collection of stories based off of the discoveries that I found in the Tretter collection and elsewhere. And I found this one story that was cataloged as transsexual. Now, this was back in, I think, 1971, so the terminology definitely reflected a problematic understanding from that time. But it talked about my favorite photograph that I ever found that I used in Land of 10,000 Loves. And Lisa's heard this story like 10,000 times. So,
All good.
but it showed these two women, they were sisters, who were participants at the U's transsexual research program. So this program that was very innovative around 1970. Oh, and you're going to get the photo. Oh, great.
Show the photo.
It was just an electric photograph. So I found the index in this entry, and then I had to go on the microfilm machine, and I had to sit in front of the microfilm machine and go find it. And then there was this kind of hazy image of these two women, and then I had to contact the Pioneer Press, who took the photograph and wrote the story. And I said, "Do you have the photograph?" And they said, we have to go find it." And then they found it, the negative of it, and they were able to reproduce this image. And the thing about it is that what you can see, and there they are, they're in front of what's the Palace Theater in St. Paul, and they were standing underneath a marquee that's about the Christine Jorgensen story. Has anybody ever heard of that film? It's awful, because like an exploitation film. But what you see is that it's all they had. This film was all that they had, and they're posing for a photograph that was on the front page of the paper. And you can just see that they look beautiful and they look very calm, but one of them is clutching her bag. You can just see that there's this fear of this exposure that they have to face. And so that discovery was the one that I always will remember, that I found that, and that if a series of events had not occurred in just the right way, I never would have found it, and it would have probably vanished. And if you think about that, and you think about all the possibilities that are out there that haven't yet been discovered, I think that's why I still write books. I mean, that's why I do history. That's why I love it so much. So I think that, to discover LGBT histories, you have to take almost queer paths to find it, that the traditional paths that you take may not elicit the same responses, except for now that the Tretter collection is starting to build up. Now maybe a more direct route is possible, but you always have to keep your eyes out for those alternatives, those strange ways to get there. That makes
On my very first day on the job, Lisa and I took a drive out to Woodbury.
Someplace, yeah.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
It was way out way east of here, east of St. Paul, and we picked up the papers and documents and artifacts from a woman named Jane B, who was the first out trans woman to be elected a delegate for the Democratic National Convention, Air Force pilot, just this outspoken transgender activist in Minnesota and in the Twin Cities for years and years and years. And she was getting ready to move to St. Petersburg, Florida, which she has since done. But we went and picked up those things, and it's kind of like she had a recording of the Christine Jorgensen, which she had actually borrowed from the Tretter collection, but we got it back, right? But she had this original sort of 78 interview with Christine Jorgensen, and you brought up that image and that marquee. I mean, when I was 14, that was the first, and I write about this in my poetry too. Like that was the first person that I connected with that had a transgender history and identity. So I went to the library in Chicago, and literally I was so afraid I didn't check the book out. I read the entire book at the library and left it there. So so when you were describing that photo, and just like that was the only thing that people had to reach for, I had this sort of this chill come over me, this flashback of, I mean, how important even that exploitive story was to community. So it's just really interesting.
Just one thing I was thinking about is the things that are not yet discovered. In a lot of the oral history, when you said the lesbians were sitting around making consensus, I thought, yep. There needs to be a lot more interviewing of folks so that we can find those things, because right now it's not there and it's so rich. But I'm sure that's true in all of our parts of our community. But I know, and that's one of the things that you do have in mind in numerous parts of the community to do more oral history.
Martha, do you have anything you want to? Okay. Jason, you had a question, and then we'll close up. And
Hi, Jason Jackson. So my question is thinking about individuals, be it that we're lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and so many of our identities, so much of our stuff means so much to us, right? And I love that you just, told everybody in this room that we're all responsible for going out and getting this stuff, and Martha, you mentioned like go out and get it. But some of these things mean so much to us. And I've had the experience of going into someone's basement of a queer woman and seeing a box full of stuff from like 1962 and all these things. I'm like, ooh, Lisa would have a fit, right? So my question is, and this is for the panelists and definitely for you, Lisa, what are some of the strategies to actually getting people to donate some of their like most treasured things? And for a lot of us, we don't have much to begin with. We don't have that much history. And so a keychain could mean the world to us, but how would we convince each other to donate the stuff to the archives?
do any of you want to take a stab? I'll talk about it too, but if you want to.
Really, I think it's personal relationship building and personal conversations I've seen make a difference. And like I said, letting people know that their things will be, we don't keep necessarily every single scrap of paper that is, donated to the Tretter collection, but that their materials are valued and will be cared for and preserved. And I also talk about youth, that we want youth to be able to find these things and to know, and convincing people that all of their stuff matters. People will discount documents that they think we don't care about, and I'm like, oh, just give us the whole box. Don't look through the whole box. Just we want the whole box. We want all the stuff. But I really think a lot of it is about personal conversations.
Well, I think that this it touches on really important work that Eric Collieri did. Eric worked at the Tretter collection for a long time, and he wrote a really fantastic dissertation that I recommend you all go look for. It's available. You can go look for it on Google Scholar. That's a librarian in me. But Eric told me, and I don't know. I know Eric wrote it. Collieri is his last name. You can look for it on Google Scholar, and you'll find it. He wrote about how, and he talked to me about how so many members of the LGBT community for so long couldn't have children and couldn't have, almost like a legacy that they could build in a traditional conception of what legacy meant. And so the archive actually becomes legacy. It becomes not a proxy for it, but just a different kind of legacy. It helps us rethink what a legacy could be in the very first place. And so I think that is a really important thing to note, and that it really touches off of what you were saying, Martha, that the archive gives us an opportunity to communicate across generations in a way that I think maybe more normative folks take for granted.
I'm trying to find Eric's dissertation, and we're going to have to look for that afterwards. You look for it. Okay. I was busy trying to prove I wasn't a robot to Google Scholar. I think Martha's right that a personal relationship is important. There's kind of two extremes in that. Some people are going to say, oh, this is just my crap, you don't want it. And other people are going to say, this is so important to me. And I do want those photographs. So it's those two extremes. I would suggest that if you or someone you know has materials that you know need to come to the archive, you can contact me. I find sometimes doing a tour of the archive really helps people. It gives them the concept that they're not doing this in isolation, that their materials are going to be cared for in a way that they cannot begin to provide for on their own, that they will be safe, that they can come visit them, that they can have access to them, but that everyone can have access to them. So I think a relationship, I think that a tour, I think sometimes people are able to give us copies of things, or we make copies and give them back. And I think the other thing we can say to people is, if you can't let go of it right now, okay, but please be sure that you tell the person who's responsible for you if something happens, that this has to go to the archive. Put it in the box that says, take me to Tretter. Exactly. Eric's dissertation is titled Beyond the Closet, LGBT and Queer Archiving in the United States. And that really segues very nicely into what I was planning to say as a closing. First, I want to mention, keeping in mind Stewart's warning earlier about being self-congratulatory, I do have a PowerPoint that I've created at the Tretter collection about, it's called Minnesota Nice, GLBT Moments in the Heartland. And it is about those times when GLBT history has been made in Minnesota. And all of our panelists feature in it rather heavily. The Because Conference and BOP are in the PowerPoint. It relies very heavily on Stewart's research and the book, Naked Stages, and some of the work that Andrea has done. Certainly Karen, both with the Lesbian Feminist Organizing Committee with her role in It's Time Minnesota and serving in the legislature are all there. So it is, but it's a really lovely moment just to sit back and go, we've had some amazing accomplishments in the state of Minnesota. That's available. I do it for organizations. So if you're interested or have a group that might like to see that, call me. In closing, I just want to say that it's been said that history belongs to those who write it. And there is truth to that. But really, history belongs to those who archive. Because those who write history rely on sources. And we are those sources. Each of us has a role to play. And those roles are keep your paper and your emails. Keep your research and your projects. Keep your photos and your journals. Keep your folders, your files, your flyers, your letters. Keep it all. And get them to an archive or make sure that someone else knows to do that if anything happens to you. Each of us is responsible for making sure our voice is available for history. No one will do this for us. No one can do this for us. Make history, keep history, archive history. Thank you all for being here today. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you. Come up and talk to us as we wrap up, and have a good rest of your Friday. Thank you.
I have a question for the both of you. Maybe within your book, you show the two sticks from Scranton. It was
Yeah, wasn't that great? It was great.
I've always wondered whatever happened to them. They moved to Florida, and I asked you, I was just wondering if you know anything more. Because when I saw that, I was just, I think they had a surgery over like 1 or 2 days of time. I tried finding them, but
I'm Claire. I got in touch with you, and Ann and I worked together to put this together. We developed programs. Thank you so much. Thank you for your work and everything that you said. And I really